what a retrofit assessor actually looks at, and why it matters before you spend anything. Most homeowners go from EPC to getting quotes for individual measures. EPC says cavity wall insulation, so they call 3 insulation companies. EPC says heat pump, so they call 3 heat pump installers. The problem with that sequence is that no one in it is responsible for the whole building. Each installer is scoping their own measure in isolation. No one is checking how the measures interact, what the moisture risks are, or whether the sequencing makes sense for this specific property. The gap between the EPC and the first installer's visit is where the most expensive retrofit mistakes happen. In this video, we're going to look at what fills that gap properly, why it matters, and when you actually need it before spending anything significant. What a retrofit assessment actually is. A retrofit assessment is a whole building analysis carried out by a qualified retrofit assessor or coordinator. It looks at the building as a system, not as a list of individual measures that can be addressed independently. The framework governing this in the UK is PAS 2035, the publicly available specification for retrofit. Under PAS 2035, significant retrofit work on domestic buildings should be specified and overseen by a retrofit coordinator, starting from a whole building assessment. In practice, a lot of retrofit work still happens outside this framework, particularly for smaller individual measures. But for any significant spend, any combination of measures, or any complex property type, a retrofit assessment is the document that makes everything downstream more likely to work. What the assessor looks at in detail. Let me walk through what a good retrofit assessment actually covers, because it's substantially more than what an EPC assessor does. Wall construction and condition. Not just what type of wall it is, but whether there's any existing insulation, and what condition it's in, whether there are signs of moisture that would affect what can be installed, and whether the wall construction is suitable for the proposed measure. Roof and loft. Depth and condition of existing insulation, whether the loft void is ventilated properly, access for any top-up work. Windows and doors. Glazing type, frame condition, whether trickle vents are present and functioning, draft levels at the perimeter. Ventilation. This is often the most important and most overlooked part. Existing extractor fans, and whether they're actually achieving the required extraction rates, trickle vent status, and whether the building has any form of controlled ventilation at all. Heating system, age, efficiency, controls, hot water cylinder condition and insulation level. Air leakage. A formal assessment may include a pressure test. At minimum, it includes a visual survey of where uncontrolled air leakage is likely, around pipe penetrations, loft hatches, suspended floors. Moisture. Checks for existing damp, whether rising, penetrating, or condensation related, because any of these will affect the performance and suitability of insulation measures. Installing insulation over an existing damp problem is one of the most reliable ways to make that problem significantly worse. Thermal bridges, what gets flagged and why. This is where an EPC and a retrofit assessment diverge most sharply. An EPC uses standard assumed values for junction details. It doesn't look at your specific construction. A retrofit assessment looks at the actual building and flags where thermal bridges exist. A thermal bridge is any point where heat bypasses the insulation layer and travels through the structure directly. Steel lintels above windows. The edge of a concrete floor slab where it meets the external wall. The junction between a party wall and an external wall. Bay window connections. Floor joists embedded in solid external walls. In older properties especially, these bridges are often the biggest remaining heat loss pathways after standard insulation measures have been applied. And here's the important part. No amount of additional insulation in the middle of the wall compensates for a thermal bridge at the edge. They have to be addressed at the detail level, with an insulated wrap, a thermal break, or a specifically designed junction detail. An assessor identifies them, maps them, and specifies how they should be treated as part of the insulation work. Without that specification, most installers will ignore them because they're not in scope. What the output should look like. A retrofit assessment should produce a written report, not a one-page summary, a proper document. It should cover the current performance of the building in detail. It should identify risks, moisture, thermal bridges, ventilation deficiencies, and specify what needs to be addressed before or alongside any insulation work. It should set out a recommended sequence of measures, not just a list of what's possible, but what order makes sense and why. And it should include specifications for each measure that go beyond the product name to include details like materials, junction treatment approach, and ventilation requirements. If what you get is a list of recommended measures with some indicative costs, that's not a retrofit assessment, that's a sales document. A retrofit assessment is the thing that allows a good installer to actually do the job correctly because it tells them what to do at every junction in detail, not just in the middle of the wall, when you need one and when you can skip it. For a modern cavity wall property built after the 1970s in reasonable condition with straightforward improvements planned, loft insulation, cavity fill if not already done, heating controls, you probably don't need a formal retrofit assessment before proceeding with each measure individually. For any solid wall property, get an assessment. For any property showing existing damp, get an assessment. For any property where you're combining measures, particularly insulation plus a heating system change, get an assessment. For any property over around 80 years old with original or near original fabric, get an assessment. The cost is typically a few hundred to around £500 for a standard property. That's a small fraction of what almost any individual insulation or heating measure costs, and it's the single most cost-effective spend in the process if it prevents one wrong decision or one failed installation. How to find a qualified assessor. Look for membership of a recognized retrofit body and evidence of past 2035 compliance. The Retrofit Academy and Trustmark are useful starting points. Before you book anyone, ask specifically, will you produce a written report covering moisture risk and thermal bridge details? Not just a list of recommended measures, a document that specifies how each measure should be carried out and what junction details need to be addressed. If they can't describe what their output will include in specific terms, find someone else. A good retrofit assessor will be able to tell you exactly what they'll produce and why before you've paid them anything. The EPC Action Plan is a few pounds. It gives you a structured sequence for your property type and EPC band, so you know what to do and in what order before you start talking to any installer. Link is below. Free checklist is also in the description if you're earlier in the process and just trying to get your bearings.